want to open up the conversation. We'll get into it. We'd like to take some questions. We'd like to get, obviously, some ideas and comments here from the panelists. Let's just go ahead and start. We're going to introduce ourselves. Let's start down at the end and just introduce yourself, your work, why you're here.
My name is Mike Lovins. I do concept design, storyboards, and I have an online comic book called We Go Anywhere about a company that does business in outer space. It's about corporate power, political intrigue, all the above is good. So I'm happy to be here.
All right, my name is Brian Hales. Just a show of hands, were any of you at my panel yesterday? Either of my two panels? Okay, we have two. The panel that I showed, the slideshow. Okay, because I have a lot of images on this that were the same as my panel yesterday. And I also have a panel tomorrow at noon where we talk about comic layouts. I think it's called Thumbnails, Comps, Panels, and Splash Pages or something like that. Where I'll show this same slideshow, but I'll go more in depth of how to actually lay out a comic book and all the different options. But I don't have to play this. You know, we could just be talking heads up here. Show of hands, who wants to see pictures while we talk? Okay, that's the majority. All right, well, I'll just let it play. I'll go more into depth with this tomorrow, but this will kind of help, you know, while we're talking about comics to help kind of get your ideas flowing. But I have some examples of my comics on here. Dragon's Gate, Devil's Triangle, you'll see those. Continuum. But I've also got some industry, you know, all-stars, Batman, Hawkeye, and those sorts of things. So you can just appreciate those as they scroll.
My name is Jess, Smiley, and I write and illustrate comics. I have my first graphic novel sequel coming out. I should have copies tomorrow. The shipment was held back, but I should have them tomorrow. I teach comics workshops. I've taught, probably 20 over the last 3 years. And then I hold a monthly comic jam, which is basically like a big comics making activity where it's a game and everyone kind of contributes and we make comics together. Anyway, I love comics is the point.
Yeah. Hey everybody, Chris Hoffman. I'm the CEO of Hoffman Studios. We're the publisher of Utah's most awesomest superheroes, the Salt City Strangers. Pretend that you've heard of it. Yeah. There you go. So this is our, we've been at every single Comic-Con and every single FanX, so we're super excited about this. We're up to our 4th issue is going to be coming out next month. We do a lot of our stuff off of Kickstarter. We also publish games. We're going to have a new set of comics that are coming out called the Craptionated comics. We're going through a bunch of public domain comic books from the 1940s, erasing all of the words and then rewriting them with hilarious consequences. So we're going to have a Kickstarter up for that pretty soon. But the 8-year-old me would be so proud that I'm actually, 40 and putting out a comic book that is the way that I want it to be and written for everybody. So it's a lot of fun doing this.
My name's Dan Schaefer, and I've been doing comics and television and film for about 30 years. My first job was being an assistant, and I worked with a lot of different comics artists back in the 80s. And since then I've worked for most of the companies, DC, Marvel, Dark Horse, on various projects. Currently I storyboard Grimm for NBC, and we're in our 5th season, so it's pretty exciting. New season's coming up. I'm doing a new comic now called Johnny Scotch, which is sort of a film noir comic that is sort of done in kind of that black and white, very stylistic form, so you can take a look at it afterward. I've got a copy of it here, and you can go by my booth and later on to see it. So, anyway.
That's what I did yesterday. Go get one.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice. So this panel again is how comics work. So the basic idea here is we want to look at what a comic is. What are all the parts and pieces of a comic? We all read different types of comics probably, but they have certain techniques and terms that they all have in common. So I kind of wanted to look at those. This isn't a workshop, like we're not going to be actually making something and looking at it that way, but we'd like to talk about it. So I just wanted to get some ideas from the panelists here. For those of you that have experience outside of comics, maybe you're doing storyboards or maybe you've done writing, maybe what is something that you can do in comics that maybe you can't do in another media? In other words, what's a strength that comics have?
Well, one of the things that comics does is that you're able to produce the idea more quickly and easily than, say, doing a film or TV show. A lot of people, when I started off, Randy Stradley, who is an editor at Dark Horse, said, I tried to do film, and it was so hard to get it, into production, anything accepted, that doing a comic was a sort of cheaper way of getting your TV show or your film made. So in that way, it's more accessible, it's cheaper. And also there's things that you can do in comics that you can't do in film. You can do more stylistic things and things that the real world, it wouldn't exist in the real world, I think it gives you a little more flexibility too, to do things that would be completely too expensive in a film as well.
I like that. Like, how easy would it be to redraw a sequence versus like getting all the actors out, all the lighting crew, all the camera crew?
Oh yeah, and that would cost you thousands of dollars, but it would only, take whatever time it costs to draw it.
Yeah, that's
in your studio.
awesome.
I can touch on that. The great thing, the strength of film is obviously the visual side of it. We get to see what's happening. We get to see the emotions of the characters as things are playing out. And the strength of novels is you get the inner dialogue. So you don't just see what's going on, but you also get to dive into a character's thoughts and their history and things through deep penetration. The nice thing about comics is you have both. You have the visual side of it, but then you're also able to delve into the thoughts and the inner dialogue of your characters. And so, film, visual, novels, inner dialogue, comics, both. That's the strength of comics, is you can have, not only dialogue bubbles, but you can have thought bubbles, and you can know what your characters are thinking, while you're watching it play out.
That's great. Anything you want to add?
So far, except the language is the same in many ways. We're dealing with the transitions, pacing, rhythm. We're dealing with the long shots, medium shots, close-ups to convey the story you're telling. But there's some differences. If you ever read Scott McCloud's book, Understanding Games, he talks about some of the differences of the beats, timing that you're doing, and the way people experience it. There's similarities and then there's some differences, significant differences too. So,
if you're not familiar with Scott McCloud, he's kind of like an expert on what this panel is. Like, he would be the guy if we had someone in here. He talks about, this is how you would tell this story in a comic. These are some options available to you. These are facial expressions, dialogue. I mean, he has 3 books out. Mm-hmm. Look up Scott McCloud if you really want to know more about.
And if you want to know even more about comics, look up the book called Sequential Art in Comics by Will Eisner, who is the master of doing comics.
You can also take a whole course on this for free from Colorado State, I think it is, University. It's a massively open online course, and it's fantastic. It talks about all of these books, but it's a lecture-based, like, college-level class that you could actually get credit for if you do the whole thing. But back to the strength of comics, from the business side of things, it's way easier to recoup your costs. So actually going out and printing a comic book, I mean, if you make an indie film, that you've got to worry about what your distribution channel is going to be on that, because there's only so many. It's a lot more expensive for, like you were saying, the actors, the equipment, and that sort of stuff. If you have something like this, if you're good about getting a good deal on your printing, finding upstart artists and other people who want to work on the comic, then you can bring your costs down quite a bit, and you can actually make money with a low print run.
We may be getting into this, but remember, what makes comic works is the language of the medium. Not just for superhero comics. In Japan, they've got historical comics, they've got adventure comics, they've got even sports comics. The the medium transcends all genres, and you can tell any kind of story. And I hope I'm not jumping.
It's interesting that you mentioned Japanese, because everything over there is anime. I think someone gave me a stat that's like 50 to 60% of all their paper is manga. And like if you work in a nuclear plant over there, the instructions on how to turn things on and off is in a manga comic book.
It's part of their culture.
Well, and it's also an easier way to illustrate an idea. Again, Will Eisner did that in World War II when he was basically drafted into the Army, and he did manuals that were all very visual that I think you can find reprinted. But you know, he could do illustrations on how to, you know, put your M1 rifle together, and of course it would be easier to read. Look at IKEA now; they don't have any words, all visual.
That's great.
So,
If a plane crashes, it goes to crash, what do you go and look at to try to do all the safety stuff?
Yeah, exactly.
It's a comic book.
See, and just to go along that same line of thought before we move ahead, I always look at, and you know, I'm a geek about comics and just imagery and communicating information. But like you look at street signs, right? And when you have the yellow diamond and a person crossing the street, is that like a photorealistic depiction of an individual? What is it? If they have a circle for a head.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about? It's a stick figure.
Right.
That's communicating information that we're only going to see for 1 second.
It's essentially a story.
It's a story.
Right.
And a
It's-
direction, yeah.
It's another term would be a glyph.
Ciphers, emblems,
Yeah. Right.
This is, if you think about it, like, surely the government could employ better graphic designers, right? They know what people look like, but that's not the point. That information is irrelevant. The point is, there's a road, there's a person crossing. That's what we need to know, and that's
Right.
part of the language of comics that I appreciate is you'll use different styles and treatments to communicate different types of information.
Right.
I should have asked this at the beginning. Raise your hand if you are a writer, whether published or just working on your own stuff. I'm just curious. Okay. That's a good chunk. What about if you're an artist? Not any certain type or published or necessary.
We
Okay.
should all get together.
Yeah, exactly.
How many that are both?
That's one of the real
Okay,
pluses of being at this convention is that all these people that are all doing art are a network of people that you can talk to and get ideas from. When I started out, I used to go down to Eugene, Oregon, and Mike Aldred and gosh, who else was there? A whole bunch of people. Michael Gilbert, and we would all get around and we would jam doing, you know, big poster or something. But it was good to get together and you sort of inspire each other, and if someone was doing something great, you go, oh my gosh, I better do that too. You know, I can learn from that. So you are going to be able to teach each other things that you wouldn't get from a book or even another professional. By being in a group, you can kind of develop together.
Yeah. There's a myth of this lone genius that sits in their basement and just cranks out magic. You know what I mean? Comics as a medium is best. I feel like when it's a collaboration.
Well, unless it's Steve Ditko.
Yeah.
He still is in an apartment by himself drawing comics.
They're the myth, right? They're the unicorns. They're not usually the thing. The rest of us
I
need
think
like
half of us are in a basement.
really.
I mean, I'm on the main floor, but you know.
Yeah. Well, it's good to have windows.
Yeah.
Light is really big. As you get older, more light is better.
That's awesome. I wanted to look at, see, and I appreciate that, because for myself, if I see anyone saying comics have to be this way, they have to be made this way, when they start saying that, I shut down, because that's when the learning stops. Because if you're talking with each other, you're going to invent things together. I think.
But there is one thing that you need to do is that if you're going to do comics, you need to learn anatomy, perspective,
Absolutely.
and you need to know it. You can't fake it. So, I mean, it's tough to, you know, draw the human foot and the hand and draw a figure in motion, but you need to know how to draw that. So go to Life Drawing, take courses, talk to other people, and I would suggest, if you really want to learn how to draw a comic, go out and buy someone's comic page that you really admire, or go online and print one out and copy it exactly. And by doing that, you're gonna find the not only the size of the comic, but you're gonna see the process involved in actually imitating it. A lot of people in the 60s and 70s would copy Jack Kirby, and of course people like John Byrne you'd see that Kirbiness in his drawings, but he obviously learned it and transposed that into his own style, and Neil Adams too. You can see that in his work. So
wasn't it Hunter Thompson who actually retyped on a typewriter The Great Gatsby?
I think so.
Word for word, he just
Right.
wrote it just so he could feel what it was like to write a great novel. So, like you
Right.
said, if you're imitating a great, you
Yeah.
can see how that feels.
Right, and do it a couple times. Pencil it.
Don't publish the things that you got.
No.
But good practice.
But I mean, I remember seeing, of all people, Rob Liefeld. I saw drawings that he had done that looked exactly like George Perez. I don't know why he didn't keep drawing like George Perez, but that was a really good thing for him to do. Yeah, right. I don't know what happened to his
Muscles
wrists and feet, but it was a good thing. That process is. So go out and find a classic piece of art. Spend some good money on it. I know that when I was working for Ron Randall, when I was an assistant, he used to have Love and Rockets artwork on his wall, and I was like, well, what's Jaime Hernandez? And he's like, I said, well, that's cool. And he's like, it's like the perfect piece of art, because only what's important is on the page. Everything that's sort of secondary is not. So Jaime is someone you definitely want to look at.
Yep. Let's take a step back now. This is awesome because we're starting to get pretty specific, which is great. It just shows that there is so much to this conversation, and we're just not going to hit it all. But I would like to cover some basics, and I want to ask you guys, the audience, and the panelists will help us out here. If you were to open up a novel, and then you were to open up a comic book, you're going to look a little bit differently, right? What do we see in comics that we don't see in novels specifically? Anyone out here throw something out yet?
Lack of prose.
Prose? Is that what you
Lack
said?
of prose.
Lack of prose?
Instead of descriptive text for motion, setting, and movement, you literally get it physically on the page.
Okay. Thank you. I thought I saw a hand over here. No? Back here? Okay. Splash page. Perfect. So that's kind of what I'm looking at. I wonder if our panelists could help us understand what a splash page is. We're looking at how comics work. What are all the parts of a comic that we can use to tell our stories? We can use a splash page. What is that?
Splash page is just one single image. And it's something dramatic. In Images Comics' case, it was just designed to sell comic books. But if you're going to use the splash page, you don't want to use it gratuitously just because. It should be something that you're trying to grab the reader with, or something dramatic to really move your story forward.
So you say one image. Can you tell us more about what that image is, or in terms of the page space?
If Luke Skywalker's going down the trench to blow up the Death Star, you might want to do a splash page of it blowing up as opposed to confining it to a small panel, right?
Explosions make great splash
Sure
pages.
they do. You all
One
like to
thing-
watch things blow up. Right?
One thing I wanted to say about splash pages is I find it a little ironic that splash pages seem to be everybody's favorite page in the comic, and they're the easiest ones to draw, and they take the least amount of time. When you're doing 7 different panels with talking heads and different angles, bird's eye, fish eye, establishing shots, those are the tough ones, and the splash pages are the most fun to work on.
Yeah. My favorite is the double splash page. I did one in, it was issue 26 of Sable, and we had both twin towers, of course, before they were knocked down, on both pages and then panels along the top. And once you have panels on top of a splash page, it becomes a metal panel, which is a Will Eisner thing. So,
Selling that one either.
so I think double page is probably the biggest splash page you can make. You know, it's the most fun, but it's also the most work.
I just want to repeat, I mean, you don't want to use it gratuitously.
No.
You mentioned Rob Liefeld, I mean, every 2 pages there was a double or single splash page, and right there you've cheapened the moment. You know?
Right.
Well, and you got to take pacing into account as
That's
well.
what I mean.
You know, the more real estate on a page, you know, the more time your reader's going to stay there. So when you take up a whole page with pictures, that's usually a wow moment where the story slows down and you kind of step back a little bit.
Perfect. Yeah, I was going to ask when would we use a splash page, and that's perfect. Yeah, sometimes it's like a mini poster, you know, and you get all the characters and like a big moment of action. But if every page is like that, it ruins the flow.
And they also work for big reveals, or you know, Act 2 twists, you know, that sort of thing, where it's you know, you find out that he's been dead the whole time.
Well, and the thing is, a splash page is not just a moment where you can draw something bigger. It's supposed to be like a beat, and a beat is something that term they use in film where there's major moments along the route of the story where something dramatic happens or a reveal happens that big moment is important. And it's a little bit like music. Like if you had the same note throughout the whole thing, it would just sound like monotonous.
Skrillex.
So you have to have big notes, little notes. What's that?
Nothing. No.
And then you know, it's a rhythm, you know, and that rhythm is played out through the comic book. For instance, like, and you can't see it from here, but in this panel in the book that I just did, I've got 16 panels on one page, and so part of that is like that. You know, so you have this rhythm as someone's reading it that you can feel it, you know, and that's the same with comics and film as well as comics, that you see moments that go slowly, 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 and then they ramp up, and then there's a big beat, and then it changes the pace again. So I think that's important to notice in comics as well.
So if we use a splash page, and that was a great one to start with. Thank you for bringing that up. Thank you. If we take that as maybe like a really dramatic moment or like this crescendo, what about those smaller moments? How can we communicate those smaller moments in comics? Not a splash page. What else could we use? Caption. So if
you talked about the smaller moments in comics.
Yeah, so if our splash page is taking up the whole page, 2 pages, what about those smaller moments? This is my visual cue. No? I'm talking about panels. I'm not trying to make you guess.
I think you think he's looking for like a big answer. I think we're looking for the little answers.
I'm sorry.
I'm going to say panel, but I'm going to sound stupid. No, that's exactly what I think we wanted to hear.
Well, and there's a thing where you can imitate things in film that we do. I mean, I do it all the time because I sort of went back and forth in film and comics, which is the close-up. You go from a wide shot, closer, 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 until you're into an extreme close-up. And that is a camera move, but you're imitating it in comics in a series of panels. So, and then changing the size of the panels makes a difference too, you know.
That's great, yeah.
It's got to make sense to the reader what's happening in the story. So what's the first thing that happens in Star Trek? What's the first thing we see? The Enterprise.
Yeah.
It's an establishing shot. It's giving the reader, this is where we're at. This is the location we're going to, which is the ship. And then it goes to one of the characters and it starts to build on a situation that's happening for that particular episode. But it always starts with the establishing shot. So we know where the story is headed. And if the story changes and they're talking to maybe the Klingon was ready to blow them up, we're going to see probably the ship, unless, you know, the storyteller is concealing that so that we're keeping it a mystery where they're at.
I was going to say, so this is what's important about what you guys were saying about like knowing the rules, is that's when you can start to break them. If you start breaking the rules before you know what you're doing, you're going to make mistakes. But like you were saying, if you want to keep it that you don't know where you are, so maybe the establishing shot is a console with a warning signal,
Exactly.
and you don't know what's going on, and then you back out to the ship and you see the ship's on fire. Those work both ways, but you have to understand the principles before you start doing things differently.
Exactly.
Yeah, I was also going to mention that a lot of times in storytelling you have long conversations between people. Maybe between 2 people, maybe between 10, and so you have to take into account that if you draw these 2 people talking for 5-6 pages, it's going to be really boring, and so you have to kind of start to put on other hats, and you have to start thinking like a DP, director of photography, or a director, or a storyboard artist, and you have to start moving your camera around. Nobody wants to just see 2 heads back and forth for 6 pages, and so you can back out and do bird's eye views, or close-ups of people's lips, or close-ups of their eyes. It depends on the conversation, it depends on the story, but you have to kind of get creative to keep it interesting, because sometimes it's important that characters have long conversations, but visually you don't want your reader to fall asleep.
And the thing is too, with like if you did an extreme close-up on someone's lips, that means what they're saying has an extreme intensity. So you wouldn't want to just use that anytime. Just because you're getting bored with it doesn't mean you have to start resorting to tricks. Find ways to make that conversation interesting. Like in a film, you might go around a table of people playing cards. As you hear the conversation, you go behind their heads, and you do that for 60 seconds. Really the idea of having an extended scene in a movie helps to sort of like, creates a flow, and that's what you want to do in a comic book too.
And one other thing, who's seen 2001? Remember the scene where the crew member thinks something's wrong with Hal, so they go in one of the pods that have a private conversation, and they think they're talking private, where the frame is right on the lips as they're talking, going back and forth, and I think they're talking private, and then it transitions back to the eye of Hal, the red eye, and he can read the lips.
Exactly.
We don't know exactly until he says, Dave, I read the lips while you were having the conversation, and then the way that storytelling was conveyed really brought that.
And there aren't that many extreme close-ups in that movie,
Right.
except for the eye at the end,
Exactly.
So it really means something when that happens.
If you're putting together like a lit review of things to read when you're learning about telling stories in comics, start putting in some cinematography books into that. There's one called like the art of cinematography. It's actually an older book, but it still holds true today, and it tells you when you have like 2 characters in a frame, you can't switch them around. If like one's on the right side and one's on the left side, you never want to switch that around unless what you're trying to convey is that you're looking at something else from the other side of them. It's called
It's the 180-degree line.
Yes, you don't want to cross that. That helps keep people. If you ever read a comic where they turn different ways and it looks like they're talking into the space instead of each other, that's one of the rules that you should know. So don't just read comic book stuff on telling stories. Read books like Stephen King has a book called On Writing, which is an amazing book about storytelling. Add some other mediums into it so you don't get so myopic that you're only translating this over. You have other inputs into your storytelling.
One of the easiest rules for that is if someone starts on the left-hand side, they're always on the left-hand side.
Unless you want your reader to be uncomfortable. And one of the characters is a beautiful woman in a red dress and the other guy's in a suit. Sometimes there's reason to break the rules, but you have to know you're breaking them and know what they are and why they're there.
Don't risk it if you're going to lose the reader, though.
Yeah.
If they have to go back and read it again, it's kind of, you've blown the moment.
Yeah, if you ever read Morning Glories, which is an amazing comic, but about 20 comics into it, they started to take 4 pages at the end of the book to explain what the heck happened. So that's not exactly the best visual storytelling that they're doing.
No.
And make sure when you're breaking the rules, you're breaking them at the right times and for the right reasons.
Well, I would say if anyone in here isn't a professional, don't break the rules. I mean, break the rules later. I mean, once you know them. But don't even think about breaking the rules now. It's not.
A couple times pacing was brought up, and that's not a comics thing. That's just how we control the pacing in comics is different than we do in novels and movies and things like that. one page comes to mind. Craig Thompson made a graphic novel called Blankets. Has anyone read that by chance? Okay, a few people.
Mark.
It's a beautiful book. Check it out. Blankets by Craig Thompson. There's one spread in particular. I was teaching a comics workshop, and I just flipped open the page, and we were just talking about what we saw happening on that page. We're just saying, I see this happens, and just identifying the sequence of events, right? And it was really cool because there were 4 panels that were wordless, so no characters were talking. Craig was getting in a van with his friends. He moves around, they close the door. And then the bottom panel, it doesn't have a border around it, it's just an open panel, right? And it's his van pulling out of a snowy parking lot, and then his mom left there waving goodbye. Excuse me, they wave goodbye, and then that last panel is him driving and she's standing there. And I thought that was just such a beautiful build because you have these 4 panels that are just moments. He gets in the car, he's happy to see his friends, closes the van, waves to his mom. And any of you that have ever had to say goodbye to a significant other for a period of time, you know that goodbye is really fast, and that moment right after goodbye seems to last a long time. And that's exactly what happened visually. Is those were small panels, small moments saying goodbye, and then that last panel, Mom is standing there alone. There are lines from the van leading away from him driving off, and that moment doesn't have a border around it, so it seeps up into the rest of that page, and that moment lasts, it spreads throughout the whole book. Really beautiful, poetic way that I wouldn't have recognized had I not just opened it and looked at it. So we're talking about controlling pacing. Let's talk about speech bubbles. How can we use...
Before you go to speech bubbles, I just want to make one point. That sounds awesome. Yep. If you really, I read a thing where Marvel editors were talking to new people saying you should be able to tell what's going on in the story without words. Words are super important. We'll talk about that next. But you really want to see like some amazing visual storytelling to learn from any issues of Age of Reptiles. It is about dinosaurs, and you get this emotional story of parents and families and community and stuff like that with no words involving dinosaurs. So that's a good one to study as well.
Yeah, just speech bubbles in text. Like, how can we use that to tell better stories or certain parts?
I think one of the best letters ever was Ken Bruzenak on American Flag, because he took graphics and he took the lettering and he took it to a new level, because sound effects became a real visual thing. Boom became boom, 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 boom across the screen or across the page, or you would have typing would be tick, 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 but it would be a feel to that. So find ways to make the lettering incorporated, and into the storytelling.
You've got 2 things to deal with lettering. First, the artist should have composed their shots to allow for space for the lettering to begin with, right? So that you have enough room to put the captions. The second thing is you take a look at some of the good letters, they compose their bubbles. It isn't just boring symmetrical shot. They compose to not only be aesthetically pleasing, but to lead the eye through the panels. You'll see we use a lot of letters now, just do computer lettering. But if you've ever read Cerebus by Dave Sim, he really turned lettering into an art form.
Yeah.
He emphasizes certain letters, he designs them differently, and it's just really enjoyable.
Well, he was even a letterer before he was a penciler.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I just want to mention, if you're a comic book artist, unless you intentionally mean to, artfully, letter your comic and make it beautiful, leave the words off and, leave that for the computer later unless you intentionally mean to spend some time, on that lettering.
But just one thing to jump in, when I was going to school at Utah State, the professor was always like, oh, you didn't leave room for the type, you didn't leave room for the gutter. Compose your shots to allow for type for the story.
Yeah, I say leave the lettering off, but have in mind where it's going to go, for sure. Yeah.
Mike brought up an interesting point that I think is worth just touching on, and feel free to add. But I think, like with comics, we have what we want to say. So with speech bubbles specifically, whatever the character's saying, the words themselves, we have what they want to say, and then we have how we say it, how we communicate that, the shape, the size, the color, the font, the angle, all of that. Like, we can do that in comics.
Right. Yeah.
One piece of advice that I always got from this is just think about your panel. If you're into superhero, this is a Tights and Fights piece of advice here, is that you'll hear a lot of artists that like they're really excited to draw the character, but they don't like drawing that if they're in a grocery store. Rob Liefeld once again. Lots of those epic battles happen in hallways with a line going down the side. But if you start thinking about the panel as one piece of artwork, the character, the words, the motion, the moving across, you'll have a lot more of a success if that's the type of comic that you're trying to create. If you're going for more of a Japanese style, they use a lot of different things where they use non sequitur panels. They use panels that have nothing to do with the story, that like it'll be someone talking and then there'll be just a park and then rain and a car, and it's just it's a little bit different. So once again, it depends on what type of comic you're trying to create. You know what I mean? If you're trying to create a commercially successful one, or if you have like an expression of art that you are trying to get across, the rules change at that point. If you're doing some sort of experimental or something like that, then you're in a whole different realm. But once again, I still do think that a foundation of rules will even make the avant-garde weird stuff better.
Just a thought on that. I was at San Diego Comic-Con year before last, and the art director at DC Comics was speaking to us, and he said we get obviously thousands of submissions of pictures of Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman, and he said what sets certain artists apart from others is that they don't just exhibit the ability to draw Superman, but they can also draw Metropolis, and they can draw it really well, and they can also draw Gotham City. And so it's important to not leave out the importance of setting, because our characters grow up in the setting, and the setting often is just as important as the character that creates or that spawns from the setting. So,
Well, in film, I've worked with a lot of different art directors and production designers, and one of them, Stephen J. Lineweaver, who I worked with on a movie years ago. We went through his studio where he was developing the look of the film, and the whole idea of each room was to tell something about that character. So things that they would use, elements of their life are in that room. So, if they didn't clean up their house a lot, maybe they had dirty curtains, or maybe it's a spotless place, and that tells something about the character. So keep in mind when you watch movies and read comics that look at the backgrounds and the setting to see how it establishes the character that lives there, or the city streets and wherever it's at, and I think if you keep a sketchbook, draw from life as much as possible, and some of those elements that you see in life you can add back into your comic later, and that adds a little of your life into the comic too.
We're in the middle of like a really exciting time for comics. Like culturally, like people are more into them, than ever. They're more widespread and broad. And now we're moving away from the conversation. It used to be a lot of people thought the comics were a genre. They were one specific thing, and now we're seeing the way that comics have always been. Comics are just one way of telling a story. It's not a type of story. Comics are just the language, like Mike mentioned, that's how we tell our story. It's cool we can take these splash pages, these panels, the setting, the text, panels, and we can apply them to a horror comic just as we could a biographical comic or an action story, anything like that. We have about 10 minutes here. I want to see if any of you have questions, maybe about how comics work. That's what this panel is, that maybe we could address. Maybe something you've been working on or something you've noticed in a comic.
There's this microphone too.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, there's a mic up here. You can come up.
Come up and pose your question.
You're gonna do that.
Yeah, and keep them coming, because like I said, we have 10 minutes, so if you have a question, jump right up.
I've noticed in pretty much everything, medians, there's a rule of 3 that you say to do it 3 times and everything. Is there a rule of 3 to anything in comics?
You mean
Composition.
rule?
Yeah. Say if you're drawing a character and you have to draw the background, where are you going to put the horizon line? Oftentimes, just some basic rules with the rule of thirds is if to bring the horizon line to the eyes, or if the mouth is more important to the mouth, or whatever. Also, it's important to rather than cut your panel in half. Halvesies is bad. Remember, halvesies is bad. Thirds. So if you have a horizon line, maybe a foreground line or a sidewalk or a road, cut your panel into thirds, and it's just more powerful, and it helps the reader to direct their eye, where it needs to go. So draw those thirds, and then use those corners. Oh yeah, there we go.
So if
use
the
those
outside-
corners as points of interest.
If the outside is the outside of the panel, these 4 places are where you put heads, cars, explosions, etc.
Well, also too, something in the middle is motionless. So you're going to that point, you're not going anywhere else. Oftentimes, I will put something to the extreme left or right so that you have to travel to that point. It's a little like milk in a grocery store. Where is it? It's in the back. So you have to walk all the way to the back, and you see everything on the way there. So you have to find ways to get your reader to move through the page and to get to their destination.
One thing I really want to make an emphasis is keep your panels simple. There's a real tendency now for a lot of artists to be really fancy and confusing storytelling with graphic design. They're not the same. I'm thinking of the Killing Joke. Brian, who's the artist? Brian, what's his last name? Huh? Brian Hahn. His philosophy was, I work within the same strips and borders. I don't get into all this panel tripping and crazy panels that disorient people, because what's happening in those panels is important. It's the most important. People get really just far out there, and then the reader's going, what's going on in this story? The art looks great, but I have no idea from the storytelling what's even happening.
See, I agree, but I'm also going to throw out, that's the street sign thing. Maybe they have a different message, and maybe that graphics overload is part of that message, but yeah, it is overdone.
And again, you can break some of the rules, as we talked about, if you first know them, then it works. But a lot of these storytellers, as Carl Potts pointed out in San Diego years ago, he was an editor for Marvel, storytelling is almost becoming a lost art.
Thank you.
Cool. Thanks. The costume came together very nicely.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
So you mentioned that collaboration seems to be really important. Not everybody can be artist and writer. But how do you go about finding that first collaboration? What's the important element beyond, hi, I've got a passion project, I can't pay you? How do you connect? Because you don't want to end up on the for exposure, Twitter as that guy.
You talk to, so I'm passionate about this, so I'm going to take over the answer.
We have 2 more questions.
Okay. So, but the thing is, you do that, you become part of a scene. There is, if you read the book Steal Like an Artist by Austin Kleon, he talks about this. You don't become part of a community by coming in and just self-promoting. What you're talking about is coming in and going, I've got this project and everyone come work on it. That is when you are human spam. You are just taking, you're spamming the community with what you want to have done. On the other side of it, if you just come in and you just take from people, then you're a vampire. If you become the comics scene in Utah, as far as artists and writers is concerned, there's a lot more writers as there always is, but it's vibrant in Utah. There will be somebody out there that will work with you. You just need to find that right vector of people who are going to stick with the project, be able to work under the constraints that you have, whether they're time, money, quality, and where you're violating your story the least out of those 3 vectors. Does that make sense?
You're in the perfect place.
Yeah, come talk to us.
I mean, but you're in the perfect place because all these people are potential not competitors. Well, they are actually
Collaborators,
competitors, but they're collaborators as well. So get cards, talk to people, stay in touch with people, find things that you like.
There's a Facebook group called Connecting Artists and Writers. It's for local comic.
Yeah, but while you're here and you can see people's faces, get to know people, and spend all weekend doing it too, because there are people that I worked with 25 years ago that I still know. And sometimes you don't get to work with that person until 20 years later, but you still have their card or you still stay in touch with them. So you're in a really vital part of your potential career right here.
Look, you talk to your neighbor here and you bring up your story, the worst that happens is they're not interested.
The other thing is, good
Lots
networking
of other
comes
people.
from what you feel like you can offer to somebody else. Don't come into the thing with saying, my story and my thing is awesome. Ask them about their story. Ask them about their artwork and say, how can I help you with what you're doing? Do that enough, and then people will know that you're the person that comes and helps everyone, and they will fall over themselves helping you when it's the project that you want to do.
Yeah, don't expect something for nothing. You know, if you have a story that you want illustrated, you know, if you approach an illustrator, I guarantee they have a story that they want written.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and if you're a writer, to learn how to write a script so that people can easily read it. So, you know, look at movie scripts and look at comic book scripts. There's probably some online. There's a magazine on comics writing that you can pick up, and just imitate that formula so that people can easily access your work, as opposed to scrawls on a page or you know, or just, I have an idea. Don't do that.
Also DeviantArt.
DeviantArt,
Yeah.
yep. So many places you can talk to people all over the world that you can find an artist in Portugal that is interested in drawing your comic.
Okay, we have 3 minutes.
Sorry, you're good.
How much emphasis do you put on thumbnails for laying out?
Oh,
images?
great
Crucial.
question. Great
Everything.
question.
Absolutely crucial. Brent Anderson is a mentor for me in a lot of ways. He said that the impulse to go to try to do it all at once is overwhelming, but deny it.
When you're
Thumbnail.
laying out your page, so you mentioned like a line of action kind of thing. Does the page itself and all of its panels consider one page to have its own line of action, and then the panels kind of guide you through that?
Some comic writers will actually say, panel 1, this happens, this is the dialogue. Panel 2, this happens, this is the dialogue. Some won't. When I did Continuum, Arcana sent me a script from Steve Snyder in LA, and he wasn't one that, you know, laid everything out in panels on the page. And so I took his scripts and I sort of just drew little bubbles around, okay, you know, this action, this dialogue could happen in one panel. You know, this might, you know, take up 2 because it's a conversation. I need an action, reaction, scene, sequel. You know, somebody says something and somebody reacts, that's going to take 2 panels. And so, yeah, you draw those little, you know, little squares next to your script, and you kind of figure that stuff out before you spend the time, you know, drawing and putting in the detail.
You know, since Mike Barron is not here, I'll tell you a story about Mike Barron. Is that when I started, I got these little sketches from somebody, I think it was from a writer, Tom Bierbaum or someone like that. And he basically taught, Mike Barron would write, he would do little thumbnails of each page, and then off to the side write what dialogue or any kind of description that needed to be. And that's how he would send his scripts to people. And you know, actually that's the way I do it too now, I think, because of that. So I learned from a writer. So I think that's, if you see him out there, you might talk to him about that, because it's a super way of doing your writing.
I'll say your thumbnail is, just for myself, just briefly, the thumbnail is my first chance to mess up. If I do that on a final page, then I'm in trouble.
Wasted hours.
Good point.
Wasted hours. Thank you. Good question.
How is the transition from pencil and paper to light tables and computers and computer animation affected how comics work?
Like the technology available. That's another panel right there.
Right. It's made it ridiculously easy for just someone who just wants to make a comic just to go and do it, not ask anybody permission. There used to be like the editorial process where you had to go through so many different people to say, is my story good? And someone that didn't care about your story had to say, yeah, we think so. Now, just make one. That's the only way you'll get into comics too. If you want to work as a professional, is go make one first.
Well, and it's the
I
only,
think what you're saying too is, I started learning color in the computer, but the principles are the same. You still have to know the principles of value and contrast. Even though you're using a different tool, the principles are going to be the same. So it's been great in terms of convenience, like he's indicating, but know the rules and be able to use these tools.
And one of the important things, and you don't know this until later, is that just do your book, you know, because it's not going to be perfect. You're going to go back and you're going to see things that don't look right, but you're going to need that step to get to the next step, because you don't like make your comic and it's like the perfect thing. It's just not going to happen. So feel comfortable with just doing your book the way you can do it. And then once you see it printed, you go, well, I could have done that better. And make a note, go back, and the next book, improve on that. And I think just focusing on certain things in daily life and spending a little more time observing it. I mean, I think to some extent, those are the most important skills you have is observation and listening. If you go out here and you talk to people, I would say talk to the oldest guys that are doing comics and ask them questions. And they will tell you things that a lot of people don't know until you get to that stage and try to just take it in. I think when you're young, you tend to want to be, a little rebellious and oh, that's not real or that's not true, but just listen and you'll get some great stuff from that.
4 o'clock, just to follow up to that question, 4 o'clock in this room today, we're doing a panel on tools available for artists today. We're going to do just a closing statement. Anything else you want to add from the panel before we go?
Just ditto, to make it excited and passion for storytelling. Remember, I'm the narrator. Just in closing, since time is far past it, you can see my comic online. I get some flyers at my table, White 34. Come and see me.
All right, I'm at booth 2820, and I would love for you guys to come by, check out my comics, and I'm also doing portraits, and I turn you into whatever superhero or supervillain you want to be, so come by and say hi.
I'm at booth 1801. One of the projects I'm working on right now is actually a activity book where all of the games are making comics, so you learn about techniques and tools available in a really fun way, so keep in touch.
I'm doing a quick giveaway if you want to go next.
Oh, okay. Well, watch Grimm. Surprising age. And then, look up some of these older guys. Again, Joe Kubert has a book out. Joe Kubert's fantastic. His covers tell a whole story. They are the splash page.
And you can't leave without thinking
GI
about
Combat, everything from the 70s, 60s, 70s from Joe Kubert.
So I was going to say, so who here can remember the author of the books that were mentioned on how comics work? Who's it? Okay, you are the proud owner of the first 3 issues of Salt City Strangers.
That's the one in the pan.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Like I said, make comics. Go out in there, do it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks everybody on the panel here. This was an honor.